Alright guys, today I'll be debunking Kaizen's so-called counter document. If you want more context on this situation, I recommend watching my previous 2 videos first. With that out of the way, let's get straight into it. Firstly, let's look at this screenshot. Kaizen claims that after learning Bobby was 13, he ghosted him and completely cut him off. However, when we look at the messages he supposedly ghosted, it appears that some of Kaizen's messages may have been deleted, which makes it difficult to verify the story he is presenting. If we look at Kaizen's rebuttal, he says Bobby was too young, which would suggest that this is where the relationship ended on May 4th, 2026. Kaizen also claims that he was unaware Bobby was 13. However, there were already mentions of Bobby's age and the fact that he was in middle school as early as 2025. What makes this even more questionable is the timing. Kaizen only decided to end the relationship after we began sharing screenshots of him acknowledging Bobby's age in guild servers. Those screenshots were being circulated around April 30th, 2026, and just a few days later, on May 4th, Kaizen claims the relationship was over. So while Kaizen says he had no idea Bobby was a child, the timeline raises questions about when he actually became aware of Bobby's age. Now let's move on to another screenshot. Kaizen claims that we took his messages out of context. The person in the conversation was supposedly asking whether Kaizen had any PvEs, and Kaizen claims that his main was Bobby. However, the messages that would provide the full context appear to have been deleted. We have a screenshot showing the original conversation, and I'll put that on screen now. Looking at the original messages, it appears that Kaizen himself was the one referring to Bobby as his main, so the context he provides in his document doesn't seem to match the original conversation that we have. There's also another screenshot where Kaizen says that he isn't into middle schoolers. In his document, he claims that we took this conversation out of context. Fortunately, we have the rest of the conversation. If we scroll further down, we can see Kaizen talking about waiting for Bobby and saying that he was pre-ordering him. Now, obviously, Kaizen can't explain what he meant by that. But when you're looking at the entire conversation rather than a cropped screenshot, I think it's fair to question why those messages were left out of his response. Next, let's talk about Nubertin and Keksari. Kaizen claims that Nubertin was using Keksari as a leverage to get himself banned from the Chime server. However, that isn't what happened according to the information we have. Nubertin originally contacted Keksari, but Keksari never agreed to or was bribed into doing anything. So, once again, Kaizen's explanation doesn't appear to line up with what actually happened. Now let's talk about the coda screenshot. Kaizen attempts to explain the message by saying it was autocorrect, and yes, coda can apparently autocorrect into kids. But even if that is true, the bigger question is, why would coda knowingly spread the screenshot around if the message was supposedly completely out of context? That's something I think people should consider for themselves. And honestly, Kaizen's response barely addresses some of the other allegations involving Bobby. For example, there's the thigh picture situation, which we have evidence for and which is also included in the document, as well as the role-playing allegations involving Evan Spear. These are things that I believe deserved a proper response rather than simply being brushed aside. Finally, let's talk about the ESP situation. Kaizen says that he doesn't clip for hidden tech, while also openly talking about ESP. And honestly, I don't expect him to explain exactly what his so-called ESP tech is, because if someone asks him about it, I don't think he's going to provide any actual evidence or explanation for it. But that's something you can decide for yourself. Overall, after going through Kaizen's counter document, I don't think it actually addresses the majority of the evidence presented against him. A lot of the response relies on saying that screenshots were taken out of context, while some of the surrounding messages are missing or deleted. So, instead of just looking at Kaizen's document by itself, I think it's important to compare his claims with the original screenshots, the dates, and the full conversation. With that said, that's my response to Kaizen's counter document.